mode.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a moment. We're just letting a few more people get dialed in really quickly, and we want to make sure that you all can hear us. So give us just a moment here. I'm doing a quick test. Okay, we did our sound check. It is successful, so that tells me that people out in the world there can hear us. So welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Railroad Safety Culture, Past, Present, and Future. It's being brought to you by the Short Line Safety Institute and the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. My name is Sabrina Weiss. I'm the Vice President of Education and Business Development for the association. And I just want to go over a few details before we begin. I want to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar, and we will make the recording available to participants next week in case you want to go back and review anything discussed today or share the link with your colleagues. To ensure quality audio for the recording, all attendees are on mute, and you'll only be able to hear our presenters speaking. If you have questions during the presentation, you may type them into the questions bar on your little dashboard there on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will read through all of the submitted questions that we can get to at the end of the webinar. If we end up with more questions than we have time to answer, we can go through those after the fact and email you answers from our presenters. I want to thank today's presenters, Ron Hines. He's the Executive Director of the Short Line Safety Institute, and Mike Copeland, who's Senior Evaluator, Manager, Culture and Safety Performance Program with the Federal Railroad Administration, Office of Research, Development, and Technology. I hope I got that right.
Yes.
Okay. Both of our presenters are here with me now, so I'll turn things over to Ron to get us started.
Hello and welcome. My name is Ron Hines. I'm the Executive Director of the Short Line Safety Institute. There has been a lot of talk about the subject of railroad safety culture in recent years. An organization's safety culture has been shown to be a leading factor in the safety performance of that organization, and this includes railroads. Over the past decade or more, large rail systems have been working to improve their safety culture and have demonstrated a dramatic increase in safety. Class 2 and 3 railroads can also improve their safety culture, and being much smaller and more nimble, small railroads can make this change more easily and in a much shorter time frame. As part of this improvement, we need to better understand safety culture, and we have to know how it has been developed so far. We will allow some time for questions and answers near the end of the webinar. Please type in any questions that you may have, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can in the time that we are allotted. With us today is Michael Copeland. As Sabrina indicated, Michael's title is Senior Evaluator, Manager of Culture and Safety Performance at FRA's Office of Research, Development, and Technology. Mike sits on the implementation team of the U.S. Department of Transportation Safety Council and has served as the past chair of the department's Human Factors Coordinating Committee. Earlier in his career, 3 decades ago, Mike was a locomotive engineer before returning to school to pursue graduate studies. His experiences as a locomotive engineer, including a fatigue-induced near tragedy, fueled his interest in railroad safety culture and his advocacy for railroad employee safety. Mr. Copeland has been researching and writing about safety culture and fatigue issues in the railroad industry for over 30 years. He has been developing, implementing, and evaluating safety culture in the railroad industry for the past 15 years. Mr. Copeland earned a bachelor's degree in business and a master's in management and organizational behavior from the University of Nebraska, and he has completed 2 years towards a PhD in industrial organizational behavior from the University of Connecticut. As an FRA partner, he helped spearhead the development and implementation of the Short Line Safety Institute. Please welcome Mike Copeland, who will deliver the presentation today.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ron, for the warm welcome. You know, anthropologists have long known that culture influences the behavior of people who live in the same countries, the same cities, the same communities, and who belong to the same groups, whether they be religious, ethnic, or even sports. In more recent years, industrial psychologists have begun to understand how culture also influences the behavior and performance of individuals who work in the same companies, especially safety behavior. System safety, or organizational safety performance, is as much affected by the social norms and expectations of individual work groups as it is by the engineering designs and organizational infrastructure. To help you better understand safety culture, I won't try to define it. There are too many definitions of safety culture already. Instead, I would like to share with you a very personal safety story that nearly killed me and several others when I was a locomotive engineer back in the 1980s. And then I'll talk a little about the history of safety culture and the safety culture research at FRA. This is a picture of the location in Wyoming where the incident occurred. I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was operating a 14,000-ton coal train at restricted speed in dark territory. It was about 6 a.m. toward the end of my run. I was nodding off as I rounded a curve in Wendover Canyon and was startled to see the blaring red lights of a caboose dead on the tracks, less than 20 car lengths away. I yanked the brake handle into emergency, but I knew, even at 20 miles an hour, I knew that my train would not stop in time. I blasted the horn and shouted into the radio, "Extra 7220 East, we're in emergency." I cried out to the head brakeman and fireman to get off the train. There would have been little chance of survival if we had decided to ride it out. I had seen pictures of a 17-mile-an-hour collision before, the front end of the locomotive completely sheared off on impact. All of us jumped, including those on that caboose. Unharmed, we watched and waited for the imminent disaster. My young railroad career flashed before my eyes, while the train I had been running slowly came to a stop a few feet away from that caboose, which by now was gently pulling away. If ever there was a close call that needed further investigation, or if ever there were clearly observed risks that needed immediate feedback by one's peers, this was it. But to my knowledge, no one in management ever found out about my near disaster. None of my fellow employees questioned me either. There were 4 of us on that locomotive, yet no one said a word. Back then we had rules training, but no training that gave employees the skills to approach others in a positive and constructive manner about day-to-day risks and critical safety issues. No system existed for confidentially or anonymously reporting, tracking, and analyzing at-risk behaviors, working conditions, or other precursor data. Safety communications were largely reactive, adversarial, not to be trusted. We had a rule-driven, blame-based culture still heavily influenced by the command and control style of management from the military. That authoritarian safety culture drove important safety-critical information underground. This organizational culture was reinforced not only by operating in safety rules, but also by the governing laws and federal regulations of the societal culture, both of which had its own type of punishment for the myriad of rule violations that might occur. When accidents occurred, people and organizations were unwilling to share their understanding of what happened for fear of being punished. We were unable to learn from our mistakes. Consequently, we had a poor understanding of the many underlying causal factors of accidents and injuries, and we couldn't improve what we didn't understand. Since then, the railroad industry has largely embraced safety culture change as a key mechanism to improve safety. Yet, tragedies like Lac-Megantic and recent catastrophes with Amtrak in Pennsylvania continue to occur. They remind us that we must all be constantly vigilant about safety. We must work together in positive and constructive ways as individuals, teams, departments, organizations, states, and the federal government to continuously build and improve upon our safety and safety culture. Ron invited me to speak with you today about railroad safety culture, the past, the present, and the future. Understanding our past is key to understanding the present, especially how shared values, norms, and beliefs interact with organizational structures and systems to produce behavioral norms that employees tend to follow, despite the governing rules or regulations at the time. We'll also explain how FRA is working closely with the Short Line Safety Institute to improve safety culture in the short line industry through its 4 strategic pillars. First, though, let's take a closer look at FRA's research on safety culture. In the late 1990s, when I first started working with FRA, I conducted a safety needs assessment in the U.S. freight industry to identify and prioritize top safety issues. I interviewed senior labor and management leaders, such as local chairmen, supervisors, line managers, safety directors, and training directors on different railroads. A key theme that emerged was, why don't people comply with operating rules? I then held focus groups and structured interviews with first-line supervisors and managers at an annual Operating Rules Association meeting to further explore the issue of non-compliance with railroad operating rules, and published a report on those findings in 1999. One of the major findings was that senior managers tend to emphasize productivity over safety, unintentionally fostering an underlying organizational culture that indirectly encourages operating rule violations. When I reviewed the research literature on railroad operating rules, I also discovered some key articles and books by Fred Gamst. Now retired, Fred was an anthropologist and a former locomotive engineer. He wrote a lot about safety culture and railroad culture. In one of his articles, The History of Railroad Operating Rules, he traced passages from current operating rules at the time, G-Corps and NORAC, to identical passages from rules in the British military 100 years earlier. This might be no surprise when you consider that British military operating officers were some of the first railroad managers appointed when the rail system was being built in the United States in the 1800s. When they did that, the authoritarian command and control style of management, the disciplinary policies and practices of the British military were also adopted and became the foundational elements of railroad culture in the U.S. The vestiges of this underlying culture still exist in many ways in many U.S. railroads today. Although an authoritarian approach to management does provide a needed structure and reliable guidance to operation, an overemphasis on individual compliance to rules can ignore contributions of organizational factors to accidents and injuries. That, along with the growing power of labor unions, contributed to adversarial labor management relations, negative safety communications, and a poor understanding about the causal factors of accidents and injuries. This foundational culture is not what one would call a learning culture, where people readily share safety-critical information after an incident occurs to learn from one's mistakes. Railroad use expanded sixfold between 1889 and 1920. After railroad deaths rose to alarming levels, Congress passed the Federal Employers' Liability Act, or FELA, in 1908 to protect and compensate railroad employees injured on the job. Rail employees could now sue their employers for pain and suffering from job-related injuries. The monetary payouts were decided by juries based on comparative negligence rather than a predetermined schedule of benefits under workmen's compensation. This blame-based liability system, combined with prescriptive regulations and authoritarian railroad management, led to a blame-based reactionary railroad culture that by itself was insufficient to drive significant safety improvements. Compliance with rules and regulations is critically important, but it should be considered as a minimum standard, not a standalone safety management system. In this slide, the dot above the accident injury line represents a single accident or injury, one of the thousands of critical incidents that happen out in the field every week. Whenever an accident or incident occurs, it engages our reactive and often punitive safety oversight system. Operating rule violations, non-compliance with regulations, FELA lawsuits. When that happens, our understanding of why these incidents occur is severely hampered, because no one wants to share that information when it's likely and often required to lead to some type of punishment. Before each and every incident, however, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of at-risk errors, working conditions, and organizational factors that occur. Because the structural elements of that reactive system that had largely become the basis of railroad culture regulations, FELA, operating rules are not likely to go away. What is needed is a supplemental system that identifies and corrects accident and injury precursors and other risk-related factors before they lead to significant problems or a catastrophic event. One that does not engage the punitive elements of the system, forcing system safety information underground. FRA wanted to support a change in railroad culture that would increase the learning around what contributes to safety. So we developed a strategy for conducting and evaluating pilot demonstrations of safety culture change initiatives. In 2001, 4 key safety culture strategies were developed. One was to identify, develop, and implement innovative safety culture pilot projects in the U.S. railroad industry. 2 was to develop safety culture interventions applicable across different organizations and environments. 3 was to evaluate utilization, impact, and effectiveness. And 4, where successful, support broad-scale adoption and implementation across industry. To convince senior leaders to adopt safety culture change, we also recognized that we needed to develop a business case for safety culture. In the past 15 years, our Human Factors program has implemented 4 different types of safety culture initiatives, each of which has been rigorously evaluated and demonstrated significant improvements in safety outcomes. Participatory safety rules revisions, root cause analysis problem solving, our Clear Signal for Action program, which is based on 3 broad principles of peer-to-peer feedback, continuous improvement, and safety leadership, and confidential close call reporting systems. The first 2 were projects initiated by the industry and evaluated by FRA. And the second 2 were ones initiated, funded, and evaluated by FRA. Our results are quite impressive, showing magnitudes of change from 30 to 90% improvements in a range of safety outcomes. At Union Pacific, for example, in a short span of a few years, we documented a 79% reduction in locomotive engineer decertifications and an 81% drop in derailments for road crews, and a 65% drop in yard derailment rates for yard crews. The UP Road Crew study, in fact, won the American Evaluation Association's award for the most outstanding evaluation in 2011. The American Evaluation Association is a professional association serving an international community of over 6,600 evaluators. These pilot safety culture projects have influenced railroad-wide adoption of similar programs, including Union Pacific, BNSF, Amtrak, and Norfolk Southern. Since our pilot safety culture initiatives were published, the freight rail industry has spent tens of millions of dollars designing and implementing safety culture change across industry. Amtrak, for example, orchestrated a nationwide rollout of its Safe to Safer program to build a stronger safety culture across the entire company. In 2013, BNSF launched an effort called Approaching Others About Safety, the single largest training program ever undertaken by BNSF, which includes training for all 43,000 employees. Jointly developed with craft safety leaders, the training is facilitated by craft employees. Peer trainers engage participants around a simple concept to establish a common understanding that everyone wants their peers to return home safely at the end of each day. All employees need to look out for each other. They need to hold each other accountable for completing tasks without accidents, injuries, or fatalities. This common bond is what motivates employees and makes them willing to approach others when they see someone putting themselves at risk. Equally, and just as important, if not more so, they are willing to approach others with positive feedback to reinforce safe behaviors. Approaching others training is also provided to supervisors to explore leadership's role in building a culture of commitment to safety and understanding how they can effectively support the Approaching Others program. This program is building new norms and behavioral expectations for management and craft employees alike. It is creating a cultural transformation across the company, one that is based on an environment of engagement through building trusting relationships, reducing risk to exposures, and fostering a positive, feedback-rich environment. UP has a similar program called Courage to Care. BNSF has other ongoing safety culture initiatives too. They restructured its system safety staff, adding several new positions that emphasize proactive safety efforts, particularly the identification of leading safety indicators and precursors to accidents, incidents, or workplace injuries. Field leaders are given professional development opportunities in the safety department and return to the field with greater responsibilities, clearly establishing the safety department as a critical business function. BNSF's SafeLine initiative is a leadership development program intended to train managers in transformational leadership styles and best practices for safety leadership, aligning leadership to its vision of cultural transformation. Leadership training includes skill building for on-the-job safety briefings, how to effectively communicate with employees about safety, creating planned opportunities for managers to observe, provide feedback, and reinforce safe practices, and effective safety coaching. BAP is a peer-to-peer process that begins with the analysis of FRA reportable accidents or injuries to identify operational practices that contributed to those safety incidents. A checklist of safe and at-risk practices is then created and used as an employee engagement tool to heighten safety awareness and encourage safety dialogue on a regular basis. These ongoing conversations between peers continuously reinforce safe work practices in conditions that may be at risk of incidents. FRA's Office of Research, Development, and Technology is evaluating the implementation of BNSF safety culture initiatives, as well as Amtrak's Safe to Safer program, to create lessons learned and implementation guidance from large-scale safety culture interventions. The Shoreline Safety Institute is utilizing these lessons learned as it develops and implements its own safety culture program. Our pilot safety culture projects have also influenced policy change in the Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008 and the establishment of the Risk Reduction Program. In October of 2009, the U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood convened the first meeting of the U.S. DOT Safety Council. On behalf of the Safety Council's implementation team, I sponsored a safety culture research paper. This research paper was the most extensive and exhaustive literature review ever conducted on safety culture definitions and safety culture research across various industries and academic areas. The paper now provides a definition of safety culture adopted by the Council in its first ever policy statement on safety and summarizes the top 10 elements of a strong safety culture. The DOT definition of safety culture and 10 core elements of a strong safety culture is also being mapped to findings for the Shoreline Safety Institute in their findings with the safety culture assessments and as guidance when developing their recommendations for building stronger safety cultures. The DOT safety culture definition is being integrated into BNSF's site safety team training to establish a discussion foundation in safety culture. In the past 15 years, FRI research on safety culture, we've identified 5 common elements of successful safety culture change. 1 is commitment from all key stakeholders. 2 is voluntary, confidential, and anonymous, non-punitive participation. And this is perhaps the most critical element because without a non-punitive element, it simply will not work. Systematic and objective data gathering, analysis, and reporting, problem solving, barrier identification and removal, and corrective action processes, and long-term sustainability. At this time, I'd like to take us to the present and discuss FRA's Office of Research, Development, and Technology support for the Shoreline Safety Institute. Congress appropriated $2 million to FRA in each of fiscal years 2015 and 2016 to partner with the Shoreline and regional railroads to build a stronger, sustainable safety culture in this segment of the rail industry. The partnership model is comprised of 4 key partners, each of whom operate independently but communicate and collaborate to contribute to the efforts of the Shoreline Safety Institute. The ASLRRA Shoreline Safety Institute team created the conceptual framework for the Shoreline Safety Institute and sought funding from Congress and FRA to help develop, implement, and evaluate the Shoreline Safety Institute. Ongoing activities of the newly created Shoreline Safety Institute as a 501c3 nonprofit corporation include program development across each of the 4 pillars: safety culture assessments, safety education and training, research, and communications. The FRA team provides the ongoing funding and technical support for the development and implementation and evaluation of the Institute. We oversee and manage grants to the Institute and the University of Connecticut and provide a formative support role in our evaluation contract with Volpe. The University of Connecticut team is responsible for research on safety cultural tool development, assessment protocols and procedures, and validation of those instruments. The Volpe team is responsible for an independent evaluation of the Institute, including the evaluation of the Institute's design, implementation, and its impacts in industry. In its support role as independent evaluator, the Volpe team focuses on 2 roles of evaluation. Formative evaluations are conducted before and during a project to guide project planning, design, and implementation, and to help assure success. These evaluations primarily seek to improve a program. Summative evaluations are conducted after the fact to assess completed projects or cycles of a project, to take stock of accomplishments, understand impacts, and meet accountability requirements. These evaluations primarily seek to prove or demonstrate the program's merit or worth. So when we invest in nursing our projects and programs with evaluation activities like this, before, during, and after implementation, we're much more likely to see measurable impacts for intended users. There are also different types of evaluations. Context evaluations are essentially needs assessments. Input evaluations focus on program design, planning, and budgets. Implementation evaluation monitors program implementation and provides ongoing feedback. Impact evaluation assesses and measures the outcomes and impacts. Each type of evaluation is conducted both formatively for continuous improvement and summatively for measurement of successful outcomes. Our Volpe evaluation team is conducting all of these types of evaluation in support of the Institute. One of the most important lessons I've learned in managing evaluations is that getting the evaluation questions right is critical. These are some of the evaluation questions we sought to answer when we first began supporting the Institute. I won't spend time reading over these, but some of them we have now answered, and we continue to work toward answering others. As the program evolves, new questions always arise that need addressed too. When the types of evaluations are mapped against the 2 roles of evaluation and core evaluation questions identified, you can readily see the role and value of evaluation performed by Volpe, in addition to the research role of UConn. With this process, we systematically identify and help assess industry needs. We help set goals and priorities. We help provide input on the design and application of different intervention strategies, and we assess program outcomes and impacts. Applying these evaluation methods and standards to the process substantially improves the likelihood of the Shoreline Safety Institute becoming a success. I am honored that Ron invited me to share with you a little about the history of railroad safety culture, and I'm thankful to be alive today to be able to tell you that story. At this time, I'd like to turn it back over to Ron to talk a little more about the future of the Shoreline Safety Institute and future webinars. Thank you. Ron?
Thank you, Michael, for that presentation. And I would like to thank those in the audience for their participation in our webinar today. The Institute has been performing safety culture assessments on small railroads and providing information that will enable a railroad to improve its safety culture. What we are learning through this process can benefit all Class 2 and 3 railroads. We are planning additional webinars on the topic of safety culture and other safety topics, including other organizational skills, human factor information, and technical subjects as well. Meanwhile, we are building out the Short Line Safety Institute's webpage, and we are adding material that railroads can use to improve safety. As we learn more from our assessments, we will be doing a gap analysis and adding this material to our website also. Please check us out at www.shortlinesafety.org. Thank you. We now have time for some questions and answers.
Okay, so I'm going to jump back in here for just 1 second and remind folks that you can type questions in on the part on your screen. You just simply type them in and we can see them. So if you have any questions for Ron or for Mike at this point, please feel free to put those in there. I've got a couple that have popped up. One is, I understand the Short Line Safety Institute has been doing safety assessments up to this point. What other resources besides assessments do you anticipate making available to railroads to help them build their safety culture?
One thing we plan to, with the help of SLRA's committees, such as Safety and Training Committee, the Mechanical Committees, and so forth, put information up as guidance documents for railroads to use. And this will be information that's vetted through the industry. It's just not one person's opinion, because there's many good resources to go to, but this is something that would serve as a base for industry to use, and something that's been vetted from different people, so we know that it's good and it's solid, and also that it's current. The other thing you want to do is, as new information becomes available, also run it through these technical committees with the expertise there, a lot of expertise, that can give us the best resource to use. For example, if a railroad needs a safety and training committee themselves, or some kind of safety action plan, we could put examples of that kind of thing together that they could use and copy from, instead of to start from scratch. And they could use something that's been successful in the past, so they aren't really taking a chance with it. They know if they implement it the correct way that it'll be useful.
Okay, great. Here's a quick one that I think is probably directed at you, Mike, and it is, what was the title of the book written by Fred Gamst that you referenced?
Well, the paper that I referenced is The History of Railroad Operating Rules. There's also a book that he's written called The Hoghead. What I can do is I can provide a more detailed list of a lot of his publications that Ron can add to the website. There's quite a lot of work that he's written.
Great. And that is something that, as we gather those materials together, they will be available on the Safety Institute website, so we can definitely post those there. Okay, another question. In terms of a culture shift, do you consider it an evolution or a revolution?
I think it's really an evolution. That's questions up for discussion, I guess. But it's an evolving kind of thing. We're moving into it, well moved into a new century now. And I think, command and control kind of operating rules got us off the ground. People who were fighting wars went to build railroads and so forth. And like Mike said, some of these are direct quotes from military instructions. But now we have a kinder, gentler society, and we're running into much more technical aspects of railroad that needs people to cooperate. And it's not a find and blame culture. We don't want a find and blame culture. We want to, do the right thing and care about your coworkers and so forth culture. So it's an evolution, not a revolution.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, I've got a couple more questions here. Folks, you can still type them in. We'll wrap up whenever we need to, but feel free to put any more in here that you have questions about. Concerns about confidentiality. Are there any confidentiality agreements instituted before culture assessments are performed?
We are concerned about that. We have a general agreement. We have an understanding. We keep things very close hold. Some people that we work with, we have an agreement, confidentiality agreement, and we don't refer to the railroads by name if we do a safety culture assessment. So there's little risk of identifying something that we identify as a way to reduce risk that somebody else can use to some advantage that we wouldn't want. So we are knowledgeable of that, and we even our partners at Volpe and Yukon, for instance, have non-disclosure agreements. We do surveys that are completely anonymous. We don't even know. When we have a survey for the institute, it doesn't even come to us. It comes to University of Connecticut, and we really don't want to know, and we certainly don't care who responds by name or anything like that. So really, it's completely anonymous, and we go to great length to keep it anonymous.
Okay.
And then we disguise the railroad name, so with an automatic acronym generator. So it's a pretty nice way of doing it.
Great. Okay, got a couple more jumping in here really quickly, but I'm going to try and keep them in the order that I've received them. So let me go back up here a little bit. Is there a template or a guide that my railroad can use to perform our own safety culture study?
You know, this is a great subject. We have this kind of thing where people kind of want to do their own safety culture study, and I appreciate that where they're coming from, that they want to see that they can improve their culture, see what their culture is like. Our safety culture assessments are very involved, and the railroads that have undergone this kind of express a little bit of surprise at how much in-depth it is. There's a lot of science to it. We come up with field observations. We have employee interviews, and a lot of these times these employees are given to us by the railroad, or also some of the employees of their ranks get to choose who they'd like to interview and so forth. And then we also go out and do field observations. They take a very confidential survey, and the survey they only identify by management employee, or like a craft employee, or like an engineer, conductor, track person, or whatever. So. And we really don't even break it down into what they are if they're an hourly worker. It's just their management or non-management. So it comes at this from a lot of different ways. And then there's a process where we look at the 10 core elements that Mike talked about briefly. But we look at the 10 core elements, and we ask different questions in different ways. They're very structured interviews. And so what we get out of it is a very good picture of the railroad safety culture. And people are impressed when they go through the process to see how scientific and how in-depth it is, and also how much the Institute puts into getting it right with a pre-visit, looking at materials, and it's really a thorough job. So the idea that somebody can do their own safety culture assessment, I think it's a good idea to take a look in the mirror for any organization, but it's not like a complete assessment. So I don't want people to say we can do this kind of in-house, because I think those who have gone through the process see it's quite an involved process.
Okay. Next question is, was your research based on behavioral-based science, and more importantly, was it based on eliminating at-risk behaviors? I'm guessing that might be pointing to you, Mike.
Yes, many of the pilot projects did include the behavioral-based elements of safety culture interventions, especially the CSA program, which one of the core elements of peer-to-peer feedback element is critical for actually changing individuals' behavior. But it also adds other elements in terms of continuous improvement about safety, as well as leadership, training, and development. It's all sort of incorporated into this broader organizational culture approach. So certainly there is definitely a behavioral element to some of the pilot projects that we have evaluated. But there are other initiatives as well which are a little bit different, like the root cause analysis and problem solving wasn't specifically targeted at individual behaviors, but rather a participatory approach for incident investigation after an incident had occurred that was non-punitive in nature and led to an increased understanding about those incidents after the fact, as opposed to a traditional approach, which typically did have a punitive element. So yes and no. Many of them had behavioral elements, but not all of them.
Okay. Next question. Considering human factor incidents, what is your opinion of systems failure versus human failure in root cause? Who wants to take that question?
I think it's always a system issue. I mean, it's hard to, we want to stray away from the blame on individuals, because when you collect information about why people actually behave the way they do, that gets them in trouble and results in accidents and injuries and fatalities, rarely do they do it egregiously and purposely. There's always some underlying influence or working condition or other factors that contributes to their behaviors in some way, shape, or form. It might be a behavioral influence in how everybody else does it that way. It may be something more about the working conditions where they don't have the proper equipment to do things the way they should, and so they don't use the equipment that is available to them. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to systems issues, and that's why many of the people who are trained in human factors, it is a systems perspective.
Okay, great. We've got just a couple more here. Next one is, so the ASLRRA, the Association's Safety and Training Committee, has helped small short-line railroads, the small staffed railroads, with the model FRA programs such as engineer certification, roadway worker, etc. How will the Short-Line Safety Institute build on the ease of the model programs to bring safety resources to small railroads, such as UP's Courage to Care, BNSF's ACT, Approaching Others?
Some of the skills that are learned from the big railroads processes, such as Courage to Care, it can go a long way on small railroads, approaching others, peer-to-peer, and some of these basic elements that overlap between these different areas can be really readily used on small railroads from the human side of things. And part of Mike's program talked about training, middle managers how to communicate, how to talk to one another, and then giving people the skills to approach others to say, if they see an unsafe act, look, I care, and because I care, here's what I think we should do differently. Let's have a timeout and discuss this, rather than kind of looking the other way and hope nothing happens. So those kind of things are a little bit different than actually like just say a certification program or something that the Safety and Training Committee can put out. I think they go hand in hand, though. Of course, we need the technical materials, and then we need to follow through to make sure that the human aspects of communication and safety culture, organizational situations are in line. Like Mike says, we have organizational situations where we know what the rule is. Here's the rule, and here's what it says about certification, or here's what it says about restricted speed, but here's what we do in practice, because we know that the switch is lined, or it's always this way, or everybody else does it. Then that won't work. So what we're trying to do is align the organizational requirements and culture with the operating requirements and the regulations and rules and so forth.
Excellent. Okay. So the next question, and stop me if either of you wants to weigh in with additional information. I'm just sort of reading through the questions here. The next question we have is, how involved is the host railroad during an assessment?
That's a great question. They're very involved. We show up with a fairly large team. There is no cost at this time to a railroad to be assessed. But if you can imagine the investment that we make with our safety culture assessors that are very experienced individuals, the transportation, the travel costs, lodging, it runs into a lot of investment on our part, and we're glad to make the investment to get the safety and culture improvement. But what we require, and what we call the host railroads have to understand, is that we need their dedication too. That they may have to lose a couple hours of a yard switcher, for instance, or make managers available for interview, and everybody's busy and nobody's on the railroad if they don't have to be, so they all have jobs to do. But we do require significant inputs of their time, and we try to schedule things out to make it as efficient as we can. We just don't show up and stop operations. We work with the railroad to make sure that we see people before or after their shifts. We want to look at job safety briefings. We want to watch people switch cars and so forth. And we do sit down with the railroad before the safety culture assessment to spend some quality time looking over their rules and procedures, getting familiar with the railroad, learning about their business so that we can be as little disruption as possible, and getting their input on how we might make the best assessment. And we even spend time with employees. Sometimes the railroad will give us an employee, a conductor, so forth, to drive around and take a look at things, so it's not just management steering us. But the railroads they do make, and they want to. They step forward and they actually do want to get a good picture of their safety culture, and they know that's going to involve a little bit of their time and effort.
Absolutely. Okay. I think this is our last question, unless something else rolls in, but what is the weakest link in safety culture in extremely small railroads? And that would be one that's less than 5 or 10 employees.
I would have to say that the weakest link in safety culture for both small and large railroads is leadership. Because if you don't have senior leadership driving the process from the beginning and their buy-in and support, it's not going to work very well at all. And it's one of the things that excites me the most about working with the short line industries. Because the railroads are so small, once you get 1 or 2 of the senior leaders aligned around this process, it can be rolled out fairly quickly. And taking that question regarding approaching others or similar kinds of programs to help develop better communication strategies, it's not nearly the same level of organizational resource commitment as it would be for large corporations, where they have to identify and train a whole host of individuals, etc. I mean, this could become part of a research project that is supported by this overall effort to develop and scale out a program tailored to the short line industry's needs that is fairly quickly accessible and implementable.
Okay. Ron, do you have anything to add on that? Or?
Mike summed it up. It is all about leadership. The leadership at the very top, whether it's a 4-person railroad or a 2,400-person railroad, from the top down. A lot of times we see a disconnect, and everybody wants safety, but sometimes we see a disconnect between what the top officers say and the guy switching cars, or the guy putting in ties, or the woman in the office who are putting in ties, feels. So that's what we see is the number one element here is leadership is committed to safety.
And I might add to that it's not just the senior-most individual in the organization, like the CEO. You need to really think about who are the leaders in the organization. Sometimes they're labor leaders or individuals who command a great deal of respect, even though they may not be in positional power and authority. They are influencers in the organization, and when you identify those individuals as leaders and you work closely with them to develop their buy-in and support for the process, everything rolls out much more smoothly. So leadership is critical, but it's not just at the top, it's throughout the entire organization, mid-level managers, labor leaders, and the like.
Excellent.
Great point, Mike.
Excellent. Okay, well that covers all of the questions that we've received today, but if you think of any additional questions or issues you'd like to discuss directly with our presenters, you may contact them by email or phone. Their contact information was shown early on the slide, but it's also available on our website. If you'd like to provide feedback, actually everyone will receive an email after this webinar asking you to complete a very brief survey. I mean, it's, I think, 10 yes/no questions, just to get a little bit of feedback from participants to let us know how we did today. But if you'd like to provide some direct feedback or suggest topics for a future Safety Institute webinar, please feel free to contact Michelle Malski or Ron Hines. Michelle's phone number is 202-567-2820, and her email address is michelle.malski. Let me spell that for you, because it's Michelle with one L, MICHELE.MALSKI @shortlinesafety.org. So that's for any suggestions for Safety Institute webinars, and I'll put in a quick plug for the association webinars as well. If you have any suggestions there, feel free to contact me directly at swaiss, and that's SWAISS @ASLRRA.org. We really appreciate everybody joining us for today's webinar, our first webinar for the Shortline Safety Institute. We look forward to bringing you many, many more in the weeks to come. And I'm looking at the final question that just popped up on my screen, and it said, will you provide a copy of the PowerPoint? And the answer to that is yes. We've recorded today's webinar, so as soon as it takes some time for that to process. Once it's processed, we will send a link out to all participants. And I think that obviously the recorded webinar will have the PowerPoint that we've walked through. And I think we also have permission to make the PowerPoint itself available. I'll double check on that. We've got some other materials as well. And those will go out to all participants in the next week. So that's it for today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your week.